I set the salad bowl down gently right between the crystal wine glasses and the silver serving forks. No one looked up, not even her. My mother, Delia Whitmore, was halfway through a story about the time she rescued a Paris dinner party by instructing the chef to season the beef like an American. She always told that story like she'd saved a foreign country from itself. Then, mid-sentence, she turned to me, no smile, no warmth, and said it. "The help doesn't eat with family, Claire." You know that. The table laughed, lightly, comfortably, like it wasn't meant to hurt. But it did. Charles, my father, raised his glass with his usual practiced detachment and added, "Well, at least this year the vinaigrette made it to the table." That one earned a real chuckle from Grant seated beside him in his monogrammed polo. Then came the detail that stuck. A distant cousin I barely remembered turned to the woman beside her and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Didn't she work here before Delia didn't correct her?" Instead, she handed me a napkin folded crisp, her hand extended like a queen bestowing a favor, then nodded toward the spill by her wine glass. I stood there a moment longer than I should have. Just long enough for the silence to turn awkward, but not long enough to give them satisfaction. Then I sat, at the far end of the table, next to a potted fern. They didn't skip a beat. Forks clinked, stories resumed, and I became what I'd always been at these things, optional. My husband Miles caught my eye from across the table. He gave me a small shrug, the kind that said, just let it go. He was good at that, letting things go. Letting me go sometimes. As the evening dragged on, filet mignon, some speech from Grant about hitting new quarterly targets, I picked at my salad and thought about the papers I'd signed 6 months ago. Pinecrest Lodge had been a Whitmore family tradition for over 20 years. We'd vacationed here every summer. Same lakefront cabin, same waitstaff, same glass-bottled water chilled in the sweet fridge with our name on the tag. And now, my name was on something else. I didn't look up when Delia asked for more napkins, or when Charles asked who brought this particular wine, because surely it wasn't on the usual list. I simply folded my own napkin, set it beside my untouched plate, and stepped away from the table. By the time dessert arrived, I was already on the phone with Ethan, the property manager. My voice was steady. "Announce it tomorrow," I said. "After the entree. Let them chew on it first." When I was 10, my brother Grant got a surprise party with balloons, a magician, and a custom cake shaped like a baseball glove. I got a dinner reservation at a steakhouse where no one asked what I wanted to eat. The waiter called me sir when I wore my hair short that year. No one corrected him. My father just sipped his wine and said, "She's always marched to her own drum, this one." That was always the tone, like I was a side character in a story I didn't write. At family events, I was the one asked to help in the kitchen to check on the rolls to make sure everything's moving smoothly. Grant, he was asked to give toasts. Once at a cousin's wedding, the photographer asked if I was catering staff. Delia smiled and said, "She does like to make herself useful," then turned to compliment the flower arrangements. I wasn't angry. Not then. Just small. I had a 4.0 GPA, a full ride to one of the top engineering schools in the country. But in our family, excellence didn't count unless you performed it in heels with a crowd watching. My father never raised his voice. That wasn't his way. He believed in standards. When I wore slacks to Thanksgiving, he looked me up and down and said, "I miss when girls dressed like girls." That was his form of correction shame, softened by nostalgia. And Grant, the Whitmore pride. Promoted at 29. Drove a Mercedes. His girlfriends called my work techie stuff and laughed when I said I preferred hiking to brunch. Delia would beam across the table and say, "See, Grant just gets how the world works." It didn't matter that I designed the cybersecurity software his firm used, or that I paid off my student loans by 30. What mattered was I never asked for a spotlight, so they handed it to him. Still, I showed up. To holidays, to milestone dinners at Pinecrest Lodge. I folded napkins, poured wine, took the family photos. Never in them. Once when I was 8, I stood outside the lake cabin folding towels and whispered to myself, "Maybe if I'm helpful enough, they'll save me a seat next time." I never said it out loud again, but it stayed with me. And this year at Pinecrest, I watched Delia glance at the reservation book and say to the maitre d' four for dinner, No, not 5. 4's fine. She didn't even look behind her. That was the moment. The one that peeled everything back, not the words, the ease of them. The assumption that I wouldn't need a place. Again. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I'd spent my whole life trying to be included. Now I wasn't here to earn a seat. I was here to take the table. It was supposed to be a celebration. My father, Charles Whitmore, had retired after 35 years in strategic consulting. And I, his oldest child, the planner, the competent one, had spent weeks coordinating every detail. Venue booked, custom menu arranged, invitations printed on 110 lullaby cardstock. I even tracked down a jazz trio from a New Orleans retreat he once raved about. They flew in for the evening. When we arrived at the country club's private dining room, everything looked perfect. Crisp white linens, his favorite single malt already poured. The floral arrangements matched the color palette from his old office cool navy deep cream. And for a minute I thought, maybe this time. Charles stood to speak just before dessert. He was never warm, but he was polished. His voice held the quiet confidence of a man used to being listened to. He raised his glass. I want to thank those who made tonight possible, my wonderful wife Delia, who's kept my life orderly and my tie straight. My son Grant, who flew in from Chicago on a moment's notice and who's already making moves I could only dream of at his age. I waited. And of course the team here at Hillside Club for their service and attention to detail. Let's give them a round of applause. There it was. A thank you to the bartenders, but not me. He sat down. I looked at him, just looked, and he met my gaze, steady as ever, and said under his breath, "Don't pout. You don't want to seem emotional in front of investors." Delia leaned in, patted his hand, and added softly, "It's okay. She knows we appreciate her." That was the snap moment. Not loud, not public, but final. The kind that doesn't just break something inside you. It rewrites the rules of how you'll live from that moment on. After the cake was cut and polite claps faded, I walked out, past the coat check, past the valet. I didn't cry. I sat in the rental car I had paid for myself because Grant said the family budget was tight this month and opened my phone. A voicemail, from Delia, likely accidental. Her voice came through low and clipped. "She's sweet," she was saying, probably to one of her friends. "But she's got no presence. She just disappears into the room. Grant's always had that spark. Claire's just..." The rest was buried in polite laughter. I replayed it. Twice. Then deleted it. That night I didn't make a vow. I made a correction. They didn't need to see me. Because for the first time I had finally seen myself, and I was done waiting to be invited in. When the Whitmores checked into Pinecrest Lodge the following summer, I was listed as guest number 42. Same last name. Same suite we'd always stayed in. Nothing about it raised alarms. That was the point. 6 months earlier, I had finalized the purchase of controlling interest through a holding company named Whitmore Equity Holdings, an irony that amused me more than I expected. They hadn't noticed the shift in reservation policy, or that the preferred guest rate had quietly disappeared. No one asked why I flew in early, or why I was walking the property every afternoon with a clipboard and a staff badge clipped to my sweater. They were too busy complaining. "Check-in took forever this year," Grant grumbled over breakfast. "The girl asked for my ID, like I don't stay here every summer." Delia stirred her tea without looking up. "I miss when this place felt personal," she said, before it got corporate. Charles agreed. Now it's all policies and schedules, no soul anymore. I kept my gaze on my coffee, my badge turned inward, my silence intact. The irony burned. The policies they hated were mine. The schedule was mine. The filtered lake water, the upgraded HVAC system, the employee benefit package, the things they didn't notice were mine too. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was patience. Let them talk. Let them settle into their rhythm. Let them forget I was even listening. That afternoon, as I reviewed final service prep with the lodge staff, a line cook named Mateo came over from the kitchen holding a clipboard. "Ms. Whitmore," he asked, "would you like to review the dinner menu before we print the final copies?" I paused, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted the moment to land. Yes, I said. Keep the trout. Switch the dessert to lemon shortbread. No chocolate. My father never finishes it. He nodded and walked off. No one in my family saw. And I didn't volunteer the information. Let them wonder who was pulling the strings later. Miles, always trying to play diplomat, leaned in that night and said with a half smile, "Maybe we should leave a review. Could be helpful." I didn't answer. I just nodded. That evening, I stood at the edge of the back lawn during the welcome dinner. The lodge behind me glowed with chandeliers and laughter. Inside, Grant held court over a bottle of Pinot Noir, bragging about a deal I knew had already fallen through. Delia was complimenting the crab cakes she hadn't paid for. Charles was telling a new staff member that this place had lost its legacy feel. I looked out over the lake, quiet and glass still in the dusk. Then I pulled out my phone. Ethan, the general manager, picked up on the second ring. "Hey, boss. I want the announcement tomorrow night," I said. "Before dessert." He hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want to be in the room?" "No," I said softly. "Let them sit in it first." I ended the call, slipped my phone into my coat pocket, and turned back toward the lodge. Inside, they were toasting something. I didn't need to know what. Tomorrow they'd toast differently. The private dining room at Pinecrest Lodge hadn't changed in 20 years. Same long oak table. Same portraits of fishermen from decades past. Same soft jazz humming through hidden speakers. And same seating arrangement as always. Delia at the head, Charles to her right, Grant beside him. Miles and I tucked near the far end, like distant relatives who wandered in by accident. Dinner was duck confit and roasted figs. Delia had ordered the wine without asking me, of course, and was deep in conversation with someone about charity committees she had once declined. Midway through the second course, Ethan stepped into the room. He wore a dark jacket and carried a quiet sense of presence most staff never dared bring into Whitmore gatherings. He tapped his glass lightly. The room hushed. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice calm, practiced. "As part of our new ownership transition, Pinecrest Lodge would like to recognize our majority stakeholder without whom none of this would be possible." There was a ripple of curiosity. A few lifted brows. Grant looked irritated. Ethan continued, "Please join me in acknowledging Ms. Claire Whitmore." Forks paused mid-air. A knife slipped. The room went still. I rose slowly from my seat at the end of the table. Delia blinked first. Her wineglass tilted, spilling a quiet streak of red across the linen. Charles looked like he'd misheard. Grant's mouth opened, then closed. Only Miles moved just a half turn in his chair as if checking whether he was part of some elaborate joke. I met his eyes. "You once said feedback was a gift," I said evenly, holding the room with my voice. "This is mine." And then I walked. Not to my old seat, not to the back of the room. I walked to the head of the table. Delia's spot. Ethan had left the mic resting there. I picked it up. "You're all still welcome here?" I said clearly, gaze steady. Just like everyone else now. Not a single person moved. No one clapped. No one smiled. It was the quietest toast Pinecrest had ever seen. I set the mic down, gently nodded to Ethan, and walked out. Behind me, the jazz resumed. Someone coughed. A fork fell against china and wasn't picked up, and somewhere in the silence they finally realized they had never been the ones holding the table. By morning, the lodge felt different. Staff greeted me not as the forgotten daughter-in-law, but as the name behind their paychecks. There were nods of quiet respect murmured. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," and a pot of the exact coffee blend I liked waiting at the front desk. It wasn't indulgence. It was recognition. The first email hit Grant's inbox before breakfast. A notice from accounting. The family's cabin used annually by the Whitmores at a discounted rate had shown repeated evidence of subletting during peak seasons. Quiet, profitable Airbnb listings all under a shell account linked back to him. Attached was a letter from Pinecrest Legal. 30 days to vacate. No exceptions. By noon, Grant was pacing the Flagstone Terrace phone pressed to his ear, voice rising. "You're punishing me for being resourceful." No, I thought. I was punishing him for assuming the rules didn't apply. Delia arrived unannounced at my office 2 hours later. Pearl earrings, designer bag. Smile so tight it could slice granite. She didn't ask to sit. She simply did. I think things got a bit dramatic last night, she began. We're family, and optics matter. I slid an envelope across the desk. Inside, documented complaints from staff housekeeping catering one former intern. All filed over the years and quietly buried. Each one mentioned her by name. I've reviewed the files, I said, and if I ever hear you raise your voice to a single staff member again, I'll release them publicly with a formal statement. Her eyes didn't blink, but her posture cracked. Then came Charles. His call wasn't angry, just tired. You didn't have to do all this, Claire, he said. You could have handled it quietly. I did, I replied. He exhaled into the phone. A long pause. Then you could have told me. Man to man. I let the silence stretch, then answered. Then maybe you should have raised a son. Not just inherited one. He didn't respond. Just cleared his throat and muttered something about wishing things were different. I didn't wish that. Not anymore. For every time I was told to stay small, I made something bigger. For every insult tucked behind a smile, I built something no one could take apart. This wasn't revenge. It was reorganization. The kind they'd never see coming, and the kind they'd never forget. The invitation was printed on cream cardstock with gold trim. Annual donor reception, Pinecrest Lodge legacy families, longtime partners, a handful of new investors. Delia assumed it would be a formality, a way to assure everyone that the transition would be smooth. She even wore navy. I let the room fill first, let the champagne glasses clink, let the whispers start. When I stepped onto the low stage at the front of the lodge ballroom, the lights dimmed slightly. Behind me, a screen flickered to life. Good evening, I began. Some of you already know me. Some of you thought you did. A polite laugh, nervous, unsure. I clicked to the second slide, an aerial rendering of the lodge expansion. We're adding a wellness center, new family cabins, and a dock for community kayaking programs. All of it will be funded through a new initiative launching this fall. I paused. The Cecilia Fund. Delia sat straighter in her chair. Charles lifted his glass as if preparing for a toast. It's not a family legacy, I said. It's a personal one. Next slide, a black and white photo of a woman in her 60s, hair pulled back, standing in front of a roadside motel in rural Oregon. My grandmother, Cecilia Maynard, cleaned motel rooms for nearly 2 decades. She raised me while my parents were building brands and collecting dinner party invitations. I didn't look at Delia. I didn't have to. She taught me that dignity isn't something you're born with. It's something you build when no one's watching. And that silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. The room was still. The Cecilia Fund will provide scholarships for first-generation college women pursuing engineering, architecture, and systems design. My voice didn't shake. Not once. We're not building memories. We're building momentum. From the back of the room, someone clapped. Then a few more. Then the whole room. But I wasn't looking for their applause. I turned from the podium and looked straight at Grant, then at Charles, then finally at Delia. I don't need a name on the wall, I said. I just needed them to stop erasing mine. And with that, I stepped off the stage, not back into their circle, but into my own. I skipped the family brunch. Let them fill the long table without me. Let them whisper, reshape the story into something easier to swallow. I didn't correct anything. Instead, I walked the grounds with Ethan, clipboard in hand, checked the new filtration system at the lakefront, confirmed staff shifts, reviewed permits behind cabin 6. People nodded, stepped aside. Not out of deference, out of rhythm. This time, I wasn't performing. I was present. At one point, I passed by the old Whitmore cabin. Curtains fluttered. A figure moved. Delia watching through the lace-trimmed window. I didn't look up, didn't pause. She watched me walk by, and for once, I didn't shrink under the weight of her gaze. I didn't even acknowledge it. No reply was needed. Not to Grant's text, "You made your point." Not to Charles's voicemail. This could have been quieter. I had been quiet. They just never noticed silence unless it hurt. Delia didn't call. She sent an email crafted distant, polished, to the point of sterility. We were surprised. but I'm glad you found something meaningful to pour your energy into. If you'd like to reconnect as mother and daughter, I'd welcome it. Privately, of course. I didn't respond. I archived it. That evening, I stood at the edge of the dock. The lake was glass, the sky soft bruised lavender. Still, unbothered. Miles joined me. Quiet footsteps, hands in pockets. He didn't speak at first. Then finally, "Why didn't you tell me I didn't turn to him?" "You never asked," I said. He stayed a moment longer, then walked back to the lodge. I let him go, because this wasn't about who stayed. It was about who I kept clinging to out of habit long after the warmth was gone. That night, I packed, slowly, no rush, no residue, no letter on the pillow, no grand goodbye. Just this. For years, I showed up hoping they'd make space. I folded napkins, smiled small, waited for permission to belong. Now, I wasn't hoping to be included. I was choosing who I wanted to let in. And that quiet, unspoken choice, it was louder than any applause they never gave me.